we kind of do incentivize publicly traded companies, like legally, fiduciary responsibility-wise, to act a little bit like sociopaths. So we need to like hack that and do something about that. And like this feels like maybe one way that you do need to resort to, but probably not the only one. It's also useful to maybe talk about values because, well, I don't know, I respond to values more than most people, and there's lots of research which says lead with values but follow up with numbers if you're going to try and get any of these changes to actually be implemented or to see any change within an organization.
Hello and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Asim Hussain.
So my name's Chris. I'm the Executive Director of the Green Web Foundation.
My name's Asim Hussain. I'm the Executive Director of the Green Software Foundation and the Green Cloud Advocacy Lead at Microsoft.
My name is Sara Bergman. I am a software engineer at Microsoft, and I'm the chair of the Writers Project at the Green Software Foundation.
I'm Henry Richardson, an analyst at WattTime, and also the chair of the Specifications Working Group at the Green Software Foundation.
Okay, so I suppose, Asim, I figured we would spend the time today doing a brief recap from the Gsf Summit here. And I figured that would be a relatively easy thing to talk about because there have been like how many hours of programming now from various people over the last month, Asim?
We haven't got the stats yet, but there's quite a lot. I mean, it's 27 regions and 28 events because one region had 2 events over 2 days. So yeah, a lot of people have been connecting and sitting and chatting and talking about green software, which is just really incredible. Actually, I know everybody was just working so hard to get the summit together that to actually just sit there for a second and think that wow, people all around the world are now sitting down and having conversations about this topic. I don't know, it's really inspiring. One of my hopes for this podcast has always been like just getting a bunch of people on and just talking about something that's happened recently that's of interest. And I think all of us kind of can have opinions on this topic. So I don't know. I mean, other than the foundation, other than the summit, because I think that Henry only took part in some of it and Sara got hers cancelled. And I had a paternity, so I kind of just checked out for most of it as well. So I didn't really do much. Is there another topic, like something happening in the news recently
Holy shit, there's loads. So in Europe, you've seen a whole shift. You've seen a kind of landmark ruling on things like right to repair and hardware efficiency in that basically Europe has decided to standardize on USB-C for any kind of devices, all devices for charging now, right? So that totally affects that part of the SCI, all right? That's going to have a meaningful impact there. Also, you've seen some similar model legislation come through on the US level now that's been put forward to actually say, well, if they can do it, why can't we do it? So you may end up with the Brussels effect that was being referred to in the previous podcast about, well, okay, you set a decent default, and then this ends up being something that ends up having a meaningful effect on the hardware part of a bunch of the tools that we do in the end user device part. That's actually one thing that I think is worth actually exploring.
Yeah, I think GDPR has proven that something can happen from Europe and just affect the whole world, like regulation from there, because everybody's forced to kind of follow. Europe's such a huge market in the world that if something happens in Europe, everybody else has to follow suit. So is that the only one? I remember that the USB-C came along, and I'm quite happy because I'm an Android user, so everything I'm an Android and Mac, so everything I have is a USB-C. It
automatically works, yeah.
There is also, but it might be too political, but we could talk about cutting off Russian gas and how that leads an energy shift in Europe.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there's absolutely some fascinating stuff along that because, well, this is what I did a talk at RIPE 84, which is basically a event. RIPE is the European entity that issues IP addresses to people. And one thing that we were speaking about was, okay, well, what are the drivers that you might want to use to kind of be thoughtful about your source of energy? And if you look at over the last 10 years, basically the cost of renewables has fallen more or less tenfold. And particularly in Europe, I'm not sure in America quite so much, but because it's a global market and global commodity, you are seeing this. Like oil and gas is like 14 times more expensive now than it was 10 years ago, right? So you basically have this scenario where something is either a tenth of the price or 14 times the price. And if you've been able to kind of negotiate, say, green supply here, you're not exposed to like 14-fold increase in your energy costs. So there's like one thing which you're totally seeing. And there is some fascinating research that's come out of the RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, where they've spoken about how this war in the Ukraine has essentially sped up a bunch of the existing predictions about how quickly you'll see various parts of the grid decarbonize or on a global basis. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff there which will absolutely have a knock-on effect to any large consumers of electricity, like data centers, which are, in terms of energy usage per square foot, they're more dense than aluminium smelting.
Wow.
And this is before we switch to kind of liquid cooling, which is going to increase the amount of energy per rack to be even higher, because you can get away with it whereas previously the limiting factor has been, is it possible to kind of cool this stuff down? If you have things like liquid cooling, which could be maybe 10 to 100 times more efficient in terms of moving heat around, then that's going to have a knock-on effect in the energy density inside a given data center, for example, and therefore the marginal stuff, which we might care about.
But going back to the point of the war that's happening right now, so the Rocky Mountain Institute is this, because I think there's lots of mixed information out there, because I've heard there's other things that have come along. So the RMI is saying that this is going to help accelerate the energy transition.
Yes,
but I'm also reading things that, in the hunt for energy independence for entities, that they're going back on previous commitments to roll out renewables, and they're just rolling out gas and coal faster.
We might want to speak to the expert here. Yeah, he's probably got reckons.
There were two things. The Union of Concerned Scientists just came out with a report saying that natural gas power plants are running at a loss, a financial loss, kind of like coal was 4 or 5 years ago. And so that it's following the same patterns where it's uneconomic to run coal or natural gas at power plants at various times. So I think we're starting to see the same fossil trends emerge. It, of course, leads to self-dispatch and other kind of out-of-market behavior. And then we're also seeing, I think, Biden instigated the Defense Production Act for heat pump hot water heaters. So I think there is a movement towards like accelerating some of the electrification, fuel switching trends that everyone's been talking about for a long time, but see if there's actual action on it.
But if gas prices are increasing, and that's making gas power plants less economical. I mean, I'm seeing my electricity prices increase. Isn't it just going to aren't they just going to pass them on to me, and therefore we're just going to pay for more gas, and that's it?
So renewable energy generators, there's a whole bunch of problems with supply chain issues, which are starting to get ironed out with the tariff reductions in the US at least. But they are so financially viable because as the price of gas rises, the price of wholesale electricity also rises, making it more attractive to build more wind farms and solar farms. So there's like, anecdotally, we've heard that traditionally a lot of renewables in Europe and the US are purchased through power purchase agreements where there's a guaranteed off-taker through a corporate partner. Anecdotally, we're hearing that a lot of the developers want to delay the start of their PPAs because they're making so much money in the wholesale market in electricity right now, because they're able to produce power and make a significant profit, and they don't need the guaranteed price to put steel in the ground. So there's a lot of, like, because it's pushing the price of power up, that makes other technologies much more attractive. We don't know how protracted this will be. There are a whole bunch of caveats there, of course.
And this is basically one of the theses put forward by the report from the RMI. It's called From Deep Crisis, Profound Change by the excellently named Kingsmill Bond and Amory Lovins, along with Alexei Tatarenko, Jules Kortenhorst, and Sam Butler-Sluss. It's a surprisingly short but interesting read in this discussion. But I'm not sure, Henry, I'm glad you're on the call, because it might be worth actually asking, to what extent does this end up affecting things like marginal intensity? Because this is one thing that I haven't been able to understand quite so much, because what I have seen recently in our world is I've read a blog post recently from Electricity Map talking about the choice of marginal versus average and the fact that there's a whole ongoing bun fight about that stuff here.
The price elevations can do a lot of weird things to the dispatch order. So, for example, natural gas might have been roughly the same cost as coal, so they might have been intermixed in the dispatch stack, the order in which they're dispatched. A significant rise in price may make coal cheaper than natural gas, so that you'll run coal before you run natural gas. So it could affect the total emissions changes, or even if coal's lower in the stack, low cost periods could be dirtier than high cost wholesale periods, because you're bringing on, coal will respond to low cost changes, and then you bring on peaking natural gas, and if you increase demand, then they'll just burn more natural gas and not more coal. So some weird dynamics like that. You can also see inversions, so the price effects are can be kind of dynamic and update in real time.
I think this is super interesting, and I'm just using this to learn more. But coming from or currently living in a nation that sort of made our wealth from oil and gas, because for context, we have vast amount of resources that the government luckily decided to not dig into because they are destroying coastal areas, etc. But what's to stop countries from just, gas is lucrative, let's just bring up more?
So it might be useful for context for people who are new to this, because we have a few kind of energy wonks on this. There's a helpful blog post on the Green Software Foundation website called Understanding Energy Trends at the Layer Below the Tech Stack, where we talk a little bit about this. And if you've never heard of what a dispatch stack is or any of this is, there's a little bit there which might elucidate and provide a bit more background on this, so we can, if you're totally new to this.
Because this whole world is so complicated. We've got, on one side, there's rising energy prices, and on one level that is going to help accelerate the transition towards renewables, because then, if you've got renewables, you're creating electricity renewables, you just can make more money from selling your renewable energy. But on the other hand, you're going to make a hell of a lot more money by drilling oil and gas. So what I'm trying to get in my head is it better? Oh, you're saying the RMI is saying they've done the maths, and they said actually rising prices is better, period? Or are they saying that rising prices will just help the transition? Okay,
so here's one of the issues, is that over the last, say, 10 years, and Henry, you can probably back me up on this in a bit more detail. What you have seen in America in particular is you've seen this kind of glut of kind of cheap gas coming onto the market, right? But a lot of that has happened at a loss. So you had all these people who were drilling, but they weren't necessarily turning a profit. They were just going for a little bit like how at our level we're incentivized to go for growth and worry about revenue or profit later. You've had the same thing happen for a long time. But in the last few years, you've seen, in particular the last year and a half, I suppose, you've basically seen all the people who actually have been doing this. They said, we need to kind of make a return to our investors. So rather than actually bringing more gas on stream, for example, to bring down the cost, every single large provider has basically said, no, we're not going to do anything about supply. We're just going to make sure we are going to give a return to our shareholders. We're going to exercise kind of shareholder discipline is the term that people have been using a lot. And this basically is why we have loads and loads of, why you have such high prices right now. So yes, you've had demand in lots of places go up, but you haven't seen the corresponding increase in supply, even though there's lots of basically operators who have been able to do this and do have permits for drilling. They've said, well, we're going to keep the price high and actually make sure that we can get a return to our shareholders rather than increase the supply and therefore the cost, which would probably be good for people who want to buy cheap electricity or cheap fuel. Probably not so good for the climate, but definitely not so good for shareholders who've been quite annoyed about them not being able to make a return over the last, say 5 to 10 years, while there's been this mania to just expand and drill. But Henry, I'm happy to defer to you because you're in Houston and I'm not, and I'm in Berlin.
This is not something that I have a ton of expertise in, but if you think about, you're seeing price increases across the board in your natural gas delivered to your house for consumption, electricity costs, fuel costs. So all prices are rising. So it's pressure on all forces. So for an electricity transition going from natural gas heating to electricity heating, the forces are kind of equaling out. That's like neither one is any more attractive than it was before. But we're seeing renewables as an enormously valuable hedge against the cost of power increases. So the fuel costs for renewables have not increased. The fuel costs for everything else have. So there's still a huge benefit to power systems that have already decarbonized to some degree.
Yeah, if the cost comes from fuel and you don't have to pay for fuel with renewables, then you kind of got quite a pretty good advantage, right? Like this is the key thing. And as long as you have a way to address the intermittency issues or the variability, and there are ways around that, then you can do something to basically do better financially than you otherwise would be.
That's a really interesting point about the intermittency, and it's something I guess the Green Software Foundation actually talks about pretty frequently. Asim, you coined the carbon aware, which means both time shifting and location shifting. And while we don't really talk about it very often, so we're talking about software itself and where it runs and when it runs, but the things that software controls, like heat pump hot water heaters, EVs, smart thermostats, and you have to build really sophisticated algorithms to take advantage of this. So it's still very much so software. Those will be key in managing intermittency down the road. So if we have a ton of EVs, that's an enormous amount of storage that can be scheduled and managed. If you think of a heat pump hot water heater tank as kind of a thermal battery, if you either oversize that tank or include a mixing valve and overheat that tank, you can actually consider it a thermal storage. And I think those are two of the largest energy consumers in a household that have flexibility, but even generally two of the largest.
Yeah, because I think that's a key difference from when we think of data centers or software, the hardware that software requires. We need electricity. That's what we need. But if you take the homeowner perspective, you electricity you need, but you also need heating, especially in cold places. And if you're in warm places, you need cooling. So you need not only electricity, but other things. And oil and gas have this benefit, right, that you can use them for both. You can use electricity for heating. It's actually quite common where I live, but it is much more expensive with these prices right now, and it's much less efficient use of it as well. So that duality, I think, is quite interesting.
This might be a bit of a tangent. One of the in a previous podcast I used to have, I interviewed, and I'm going to put her in the show notes. I can't remember her name, but she was talking interviewed someone about the use of hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas for heating. And actually, most countries around the world, that's actually not possible. The UK just happens to be one of the countries where it is possible, because we have essentially a grid for natural gas, whereas a lot of other countries don't have a grid for natural gas. And apparently it just requires a 10-minute adjustment to a boiler to get it to burn hydrogen instead of natural gas. I remember the other fun fact she told me, which was that hydrogen burns colorless, so they actually have to add color to it and I was like, well, we can have whatever color you want. You could have pink flames on your gas, boiling your kettle instead of blue ones. So I think the question I'm asking myself in my head is are rising prices for energy, is it better? And that's kind of I think one of the questions that's coming in, is it really better? And one of the
is it better for
yeah,
what?
well, that's the thing. Is it better for what? What is it better for? I mean, it's really, really hard for a lot of people in the world. I mean, right now in the UK, it's quite good. It's summer. We're not going to be hit with big heating bills. When it comes to winter, it's going to be really, really challenging. But the same level, when the price of something is high, it means you're focused on efficiency is much, much more important. Things like intermittency is much, much more important. If electricity was 10 times more expensive than what it is right now, how would that change our landscape and the conversations that we're having with people? How would data centers work? What would be the focus on green software? Is the problem that we have right now that electricity is too cheap and we're just wasting it?
This is my free idea, and the thing I wish I had time to add a pull request for cloud carbon footprint, right? Cost of energy is absolutely a thing for equity and people having access to warmth and heat and cool, if you want, when you're in somewhere like, say, Texas. Because I suspect, Henry, you probably care about being cold rather than too hot right now. Yeah, if we might be okay in a relatively temperate place, but it's 54 degrees in some parts of the world right now, like Iran, for example, right? So the dream feature for something like cloud carbon footprint or any of these tools would be allowing organizations to price this at the level their organization really would price it. So right now, if you were able to do something like, well, we value the cost of carbon emissions at maybe 100 tons, and then you factor that into the price when you saw a dashboard, this is how you can end up having the same ways to track this and measure this stuff inside a team. Because if you're going to have like any kind of tools for in the same way that you might track, say, compute bills on a weekly basis to see, have you seen any weird spikes? If you have some way to say, show me the actual true cost, that's actually transferred to everyone else outside of the binder of our organization. I think there are ways that you can do this, because every other organization or every other sector, or most other sectors, are currently experimenting with things like internal carbon pricing. Shipping does this now. Aviation, there's stuff around this. And various organizations, like, say, well, Microsoft does it, $15 per ton, $100 for aviation. But like groups like, say, Lloyd's of London, they have figures of like £250 per ton for this stuff. And when you look at it like this, when you realize that it's actually the CO2 emissions rather than the energy, that's the thing that we are really trying to reduce in the context of climate change, it makes sense to price it accordingly so you have the right signals inside teams who are able to act upon it, really. I feel like that's a better way to think about this. And like there's loads of precedents of us pricing other things we value. So why wouldn't we do it with carbon and expose it to our own metrics inside our teams to act upon?
Yeah, that really strikes a chord with me. I think actionability on this is key. Because when you are in a software team, whatever role you have, if you can't measure it, if you can't track it, if no one knows about it, it's incredibly hard to put it on the agenda to say that, yes, we should care the most about this. And people are like, okay, great. How will we know we're doing better? And you say, it's a gut feeling. It's not going to fly with stakeholders. It's not going to fly with management. It's not going to maybe fly with the rest of your teammates either. So having this actionability, and we've spoken a lot about the energy grid now, and it's like super fascinating for people like us who are deeply interested in it. Not everyone needs to be this deeply interested in it to act on climate, right? You don't need it. If you want to, great. But we want to make it simpler and more actionable for people with like hands on desks in code rather than just the geeks, I guess. I'm proudly a geek, so I'm saying that with all my love.
And I think we're seeing a lot of efforts towards that at the Green Software Foundation, especially the SDK will hopefully make it much more accessible. So you don't have to think about the carbon intensity of the grid. You don't have to think about like what tools do I need or the carbon intensity of different things. It'll just kind of be built into an accessible tool. Asim, do you have an update on that? You were about to mention something.
You just said the SDK. I just gave the full name Carbonor SDK, and I do know the team is working on a milestone release in July, so we'll just keep an eye out for that. Because I remember there was a report or a paper out a couple of years ago about this. Is it called the social cost of carbon? Because you mentioned $15 for Microsoft. It used to be $7. They just doubled it one day because it's so arbitrary. You can just double it and whatever. But like the social cost of carbon was that calculation, which is if you actually put a dollar term on it, what is the impact on the environment, but also what are the impacts on my children and down the line. I think it was like $300 a ton, if I remember rightly. It was around that price.
So it's changed depending on who's been in power. All right. So with the Barack Obama administration, it was $50 a ton. Under Trump, it went down to $1 per ton.
Oh, nice.
It's now gone higher up. I forget. I think it's actually close to 50 again. We're under the Biden administration. But what you might be thinking about, Asim, is the UK. I know in the UK they have a figure. They don't actually have. They use something called a carbon value, which is another price for this. And their figure is one that climbs over time. And basically, they use it as a kind of way of checking the impact of policies. So in 2022, the cost that they use is, they have a range from 124 to 373 pounds, which is about what, $500, $500 around about per ton. But that ratchets up, so every year it climbs up to the point where in 2050 you're looking at between 189 and 560 odd pounds, which is close to $800 or $900, I think. I mean, I'll let someone else kind of help me with the actual specifics. But yeah, they use that to basically make decisions about policy. So they don't charge people the way that, say, Microsoft does. So it's not like a heavy price in that sense, but it's definitely used for framing this. And this is actually some work that we're doing. And we shared inside the GSF Slack about ways to think about carbon pricing. There's like high, that you can think of in terms of the height, like how high is the number? How broad is it? As in, how much of your organization's operation does it impact. So a broad one might be 15 across the board, whereas a narrow one might be, say, $100, but only for aviation, like the Microsoft example. And then you might think in terms of like weight, which is, does this impact me and my team or my organization right now, like with Microsoft, where the money is taken out of someone's budget and put into like this kind of carbon war chest for savings, compared to a kind of shadow price that you might see that, say, Shell uses or other oil companies, where basically say, we're going to use this to factor in an investment decision, or maybe with the UK government, where they use it as saying, they're not taking money out of any purses, but they're using it to decide whether they should or should not go ahead with a particular policy decision, because they've decided and they're using this number to basically account for all the kind of other impacts that basically carbon emissions can have, because they have long-reaching impacts in terms of health and, well, the economy and everything like that.
When can you buy anything in this world? When can you buy a ton of anything in this world for a couple of $100s? That's what a ton's a large amount of something. So is that price just feels too low. I mean, I can't, it doesn't feel right. I mean, does it really give you the incentivization to make those kinds of changes? I'm not too sure.
This might go back to Sarah's point around, like, there's a significant difference between not considering carbon at all and thinking about carbon in the optimization. That is a much larger leap than deciding what price to put on carbon, because it becomes a decision-making factor versus one not at all. And I think that is while we're talking about, like, should it be 300, should it be 50, I think the idea of just including carbon at all is a much more radical concept than picking the correct cost or the correct impact.
That's called the Maserati problem. I think that's what it used to be called, the Maserati problem. It's the startup space. I think that's a long time ago in the startup space. Like, it's like a Maserati problem is a problem you'll only have once you're driving Maseratis, because your startup's made so much money. There's not really much point worrying about it right now. But yeah, I hear your point. Yeah, so yeah.
And that's the flip side of it, right? Because if you are a small organization, then this number might matter a lot. If you're really big, like if you're a government, like this number becomes arbitrary very quickly. Even when you price it super high, it's a drop in the ocean compared to other things. And you maybe don't want it to be in direct competition with other things like basic healthcare, etc.
So this is basically, I'm mindful that we're getting way away from green software with this kind of tangent, but this is the idea. The purpose of the carbon value one in the UK is designed to kind of capture some of this stuff. There's a guy called John Coomey who talks about this, and he basically says absent other things, pricing stuff is one way to show what you're valuing things. And that doesn't mean that you want to have this as your only kind of somewhat reductive lever for this. But I think you can make an assumption that if you price something at $1 a ton versus $50 a ton, there is like an implicit value judgment there about, we think that the impacts don't really matter versus we do think that the impacts actually matter here. So I think it's worth, I mean, absent any other tools, this is one thing that may be more useful. And this is kind of what I've seen people repeatedly use as a mechanism to essentially help inform a decision. Because if you're in an environment where this is one of the only levers you actually have, and if you're, say, inside an organization which is primarily driven around numbers, sometimes you'll need to speak a somewhat reductive language, even though it doesn't encompass the full gamut of human experience, just because, like, we kind of do incentivize publicly traded companies, like legally, fiduciary responsibility-wise, to act a little bit like sociopaths. So we need to, like, hack that and do something about that. And, like, this feels like maybe one way that you do need to resort to, but probably not the only one. It's also useful to maybe talk about values because, well, I don't know, I respond to values more than most people, and there's lots of research which says lead with values but follow up with numbers if you're going to try and get any of these changes to actually be implemented or to see any change within an organization.
And I think that's interesting if we think about like a global market where we actually price carbon really high, and what that means for software, because we know data centers are big consumers of energy, which produces a lot of carbon. So if that means we're going to see a rush of build and expansion in countries with much more renewable energy producement, Yeah, like for example, what does that mean to the local grid here? Because typically they are kind of scaled for the usage that you have now, because the grid always needs to be balanced. How fast will that shift go, and will the grids keep up, or will there be a need to import other electricity, and how will that affect the price of both building new data centers, but also the people who live in that region? And I think it can be a really good thing, right? Because it incentivizes the increased use of renewable low carbon energy sources. But if this happens too fast, it can have the opposite effect for those specific regions.
Sarah, we definitely see that where like a large increase in demand tends to be backfilled with fossil, because that's what's available and it is dispatchable. And then only over time do renewables start to get built to fill that gap. So I think that's a key point, is that kind of gets back to the marginal question of when you make a change, what fills that change, and it tends to be fossil. Unless there's already an oversupply of, like, for example, in California, there's a huge oversupply of solar most of the year in the middle of the day, but the rest of the time you add demand and it'll be met with a fossil resource. I don't know exactly what the answer for Norway is. You might.
We have only hydro, basically, because we are a very mountainous, rainy country, so hydro is perfect. But with the really cold winters that we had and that we'll likely continue to have with climate change, a lot of that water is frozen, and it's hard to make use of it. Also, it rains less or snows less in the late fall, which means there is less water. So we're seeing more and more like local incentivized people adding solar to the roofs, etc., because energy prices are going up. And with climate change, actually, they may continue to do so, even though the energy source itself is renewable.
And I think Norway exports a lot of its power to, I don't know if you call it mainland Europe, but
yeah.
So the more power that is consumed in Norway means there is less hydro to export to the rest of Europe, and that means that power that is not exported to Germany, for example, will now be fed by coal. So there are global implications of local energy consumption or data center development. So understanding all those dynamics can be super difficult and complex.
That conversation is quite interesting, because that's making me think, well, the transition has to happen slow. Are we saying the transition has to happen slowly then?
No, it doesn't. It's not that it has to happen slowly, but in the short term, if you don't have something to fill it in, then you may end up with something filling in that gap, as Henry suggests. Simply because even if you have loads of batteries and things ready, right, it's going to take a bit of time to get planning, permission, getting all that stuff, getting them actually deployed into space. And until you have that, people might be resorting to something else in the meantime. And that means one thing you need to have now is ways to either streamline that or make it, but ideally streamline that in a way which does support some of the issues around equity, so that you don't end up having a backlash against this or against people looking to do things. So for example, in Europe right now, we have seen like this new plan, Repower EU, where there's basically a plan in the next 2.5 years to deliver 3 Germany's worth of solar in 2.5 years. Now, even if we could make all that, that's like an incredible amount of solar, but it's nowhere near as ambitious as China is doing. China's going way, way, way faster than this, right? But the thing yes, like there's a whole thing about some money being set aside for that. I think it's in the region of 300 billion euros has been kind of earmarked for this. But the thing that's probably going to have the biggest impact is changing of the laws so it becomes faster and easier to get this stuff deployed. Because a lot of the time you have this backlog of projects being able to get set up, usually because it takes a good few years. And if you've set yourself 2.5 years, then you'll need to do something to make those changes. But the worry is, if you just kind of make it easy to steamroll this stuff through, then you'll end up with a backlash a little bit later on, which will make it harder to get the rest of the way. So this is one of the, I guess, challenges that we currently have at the moment. But there are kind of ways around this. You can, share the rewards with people in a more equitable fashion. And when you have seen that happen, then people are more prepared to deal with, to accept, say, wind turbines and solar farms and stuff like that if they get to, if the relationship isn't quite so extractive with the existing local communities, for example.
And I think it's interesting here as well. Europe has kind of a complicated history with nuclear, but nuclear is a low carbon renewable energy source. And that's also something that I think if I get to predict something, it will be a mitigation approach until we have that renewable capacity that we need, because we already have the power plants. And I know, Chris, you can probably speak more about this, but I know in Germany that there's been talks for a long time to shut down all the nuclear power plants with the current energy crisis. Those are not really going forward as planned anymore because you can't spare that energy that they can produce, which I think is interesting because a lot of time we conflate environment and climate, and they are not necessarily the same thing. At least in my language that I speak, they don't mean the same thing, because nuclear is not great for your local environment because you need a final storage. But for climate, they are great. It's very low carbon.
So there's some stuff I can share for this, specifically in the German context. So we've had this whole Energiewende for a very long time, and you can absolutely make the argument that yes, having very useful, very, very low carbon, or basically carbon-free energy available for a very long time is a really good idea. The thing that it's worth bearing in mind is that in Germany specifically, it's not necessarily the energy that's the issue, it's the heating that's the issue, which is why you've seen there's such dependency on like fossil gas and stuff like that for heating. So heating is the problem more than electricity right now, or has been for most recently. So it's not just as easy just saying, well, if only they'd switched on kept the nukes on, it'd be fine. I mean, they absolutely are really, really helpful for that, but it's not as simple as just saying, oh, if we had that, then that would have solved all the problems. They still wouldn't really have solved some of the heat issues that we do have, because Germany can be a cold country at times. But
the advice and the plan for the whole world is to electrify. So I think, I hear your point, and the same in the UK. Like, I've actually got gas heating at home. It would cost me an insane amount of money to heat my house with electricity right now. But I kind of stayed away from it for a while, but I finally read the book from Michael Schellenberger, The Apocalypse Never. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chris, yeah, the eye rolls. I've been going through like a process recently of kind of reading stuff that people told me never to read. But he made a really solid argument for nuclear. I find it very, very hard to kind of question a lot of that. Because, the amount of energy that we need in the world is phenomenal. And especially the new nuclear power plants, the new stuff that's being designed and deployed it's not the same as the old ones. And just to kind of answer a point that was made that it really resonated in my mind with nuclear, was that all the nuclear waste from the entirety of the United States from history to now could fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and it's easy to manage, and you just keep it there. Whereas coal and gas, it just all goes in the atmosphere. So that there's this waste, there's this concept of waste and nuclear, and you really hate it. And it's horrible waste, but at least it's self-contained, whereas this other stuff is all out there. So that was an argument I thought was really, really compelling.
I think everyone has their pet technologies, and they're like, we need to build nuclear, we need to build geothermal, and like...
Especially in tech, yeah.
Yes, we need all of it. Like, we're going to need nuclear, we're going to need hydro, we're going to need geothermal. Like, we just have an energy shortage, or a non-fossil energy shortage. Is that a better way of phrasing that?
A non-fossil, yeah.
Deficit, gap, however you want to describe that. So I think if nuclear is successful, affordable, it will probably be one of the solutions.
Assuming it arrives in time.
Yep.
That's the thing. Assuming it arrives in time. Because the first predicted thing to go on to a common stream in America, 2030, right? Yeah. So this is one of the issues. So much needs to happen this decade that when we only talk about this thing, which at earliest could happen there, this basically, we can fall into a discussion about, it's just delay. Let's just wait. Let's not make too many changes or be too fast. Like, we really don't have that time right now. Like, we're really, really late in the day. But we can also not forget the first fuel, efficiency.
Yeah, true. And by 2030, we'll have fusion reactors, so don't worry about it. I'm a joke. It's a joke. Should we do a wrap up?
Okay, so what we've covered in this discussion is dived into all the trends happening at one layer below most of us tend to work in the stack. And there are all kinds of geopolitical implications of what we have, of what's going on. And they do affect not only people who are dealing with it day to day, but these also ripple out across the rest of the world. And as a responsible software engineer, knowing about this makes it easier for you to prepare for turbulent times ahead.
Another way of phrasing it, the war is happening, and it's having wild effects on energy prices. And we're like, there's some thought out there that these increased prices could accelerate decarbonization of different sectors, which might help mitigate climate change effects. So we're full stop.
That works.
That was good.
That was good. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show, and of course, we want more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.